This is our traditional video quality test, and we're at ISO 800 in a very dim environment. But let me just say that the image quality is not the most important thing when you're looking at a video camera. As people who produce at least 3 videos per week, we just have a workflow, and that workflow is way more important than little bits of image quality to most of us. And in that way, the Canon excels in some ways and it fails in others. First, the GH4 is a perfect example. It's been out for 2.5 years and it's still a fantastic camera. The screen flips out from the side, which is useful because you can stand over the camera or you can stand underneath the camera. You don't have to get on the ground if you're filming from the ground. That's so useful. It also has a touchscreen just like the Canon, but the Canon lacks that tilting screen. The Sony a7R II in the middle there, it has a tilting screen, but it's not a touchscreen, which makes focusing much more difficult. It also doesn't flip forward like the GH4 does, and that's really important if you're ever going to film yourself and you want to be able to check your composition easily without having to like pull out a Wi-Fi app. It's also really useful so your cameraman can just flip the screen forward and just show you really quickly what's going on in the frame. Lastly, the GH4 and the a7R have electronic viewfinders, which is so important if you're out in bright sun. The Canon you have to use live view. You can't use the viewfinder, it goes black when you're trying to film stuff. And that's a pain. That means in the sun, often you just can't see the screen. And since you also can't change the angle of the screen because it's not a tilting screen, you're kind of trying to like cover it with your hands, or you get like a special ridiculous looking viewfinder to work on the back. Let's go to ISO 3200. A couple other huge usability problems for the Canon. The file sizes are like 5 times bigger. They're absolutely huge because the Canon, it's not because it's recording better quality video, it's because they have an inefficient video codec. It just basically stacks still images and doesn't use the interframe compression that every other video codec does. So that's weird. It's also recording in a 2096 wide proper 4K format instead of the Ultra HD, which has become standard for places like YouTube. So you end up cropping the sides off, which is just a little bit of unnecessary file storage. If you want to use an external field recorder like Atomos Shogun, you can't do it in 4K. With the Canon, it only outputs 1080p through the HDMI port. The other cameras do 4K through their external HDMI ports. Canon Pro support said that the reason you can't record 4K through the HDMI isn't some kind of conspiracy, it's because the engineers didn't have access to a modern HDMI processing chip. They only had access to a very old processing chip at the engineering time, so that's all that they could do. Weird, right? Embarrassing. Another big usability problem for the Canon is it has a pretty huge crop factor. It depends on exactly the format that you're playing back in, but it's going to be like 1.7x, 1.8x, 1.8 times. And that means if you're shooting at 24mm stills and you want to suddenly switch to video, you have to actually go and change your lens. It also means that with the 16 to 35 lens that we have there, we really can't go any wider than like 28mm. So you'd have to you just can't really shoot super wide with the Canon, you just can't. Now, the Sony here has the option of using either full frame or a 1.5x crop, and we think that's fantastic. We find that so useful because sometimes the crop is useful, but it's not always useful. I wouldn't want to have a permanent fixed crop factor though, especially because the whole reason you're using DSLRs for video is to take full advantage of those big full frame lenses, and you just can't do that if you're shooting in 4K. Of course, the GH4 has like a 2.3x crop factor compared to full frame, but it has lenses that are actually designed for use with it, and you can get Metabone's speed boosters, which adapt APS-C lenses really well for it, so you have just more native options for the GH4. So why does Canon have this really serious crop factor? Some people think they're holding back because they don't want to cannibalize the sales of their professional cameras, their video cameras. I don't think that's the case. I think no camera manufacturer is ready to make a DSLR format camera that scales video without overheating. If it were to pull 30 megapixels and scale it down to the 8 megapixel 4K standard, that'd be some processing. You'd have to combine pixels, which means you'd have to do math, which means there'd be a processor that would be giving off heat and getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So if you just take a direct read from the center of the sensor and write it to a file as JPEGs, that doesn't take much processing time, and that means the processor doesn't get too hot. I think they did it so it wouldn't overheat. Now, what camera do we know that overheats? The a7R II. Even after all those firmware updates, it still overheats regularly. It's really frustrating to work with because of that. It's ruined a lot of our shoots. It's frustrating, but it does scale the pixels and it does make great images. And when it doesn't overheat, we're really happy with it. And for that reason, we still use it all the time. Old Faithful here, 2.5-year-old GH4, never overheats. It's always there. It works fantastically. And you know what? My recommendation for an all-around video camera that doesn't fail you at a good price is still the Panasonic GH4. Save yourself some money. Look at that, I got one.